There are few things inside a computer quite as recognizable as the PCI slot. Introduced in 1992, the PCI standard enjoyed over 20 years of relevance in the PC market. It brought a massive throughput increase over the venerable 16-bit ISA slot, boosting 16 megabytes per second of bandwidth to an insane 133 megabytes, a figure once thought to be almost totally future-proof. But with the dawn of 3D accelerators and the rise of the AGP slot, few graphics card makers saw any reason to continue its use for their expensive and painstakingly made top-of-the-line flagships at the risk of reducing their performance. But what if that never happened? How much performance could you truly get out of that legacy expansion slot? Technology, new and old, will collide, spanning decades apart as we take a look at the fastest PCI graphics card ever made. This is Pixel Pipes. The use of PCI for the fastest graphics cards pretty much ceased in the year 2000 after the demise of 3DFX, the one lone holdout for its continued support. NVIDIA and ATI started relegating PCI to their budget offerings in the late 90s, with NVIDIA's second graphics card ever, the Riva 128, already supporting AGP in 1997. But even in 2000, 3DFX proved that you could still get great performance out of PCI with their Voodoo 5500, which didn't lose very much of its potency compared to the AGP version. PCI remained a viable option for lower tier cards from both design houses in the years that followed, such as with the Radeon 7200 and 9000 from ATI and GeForce 4 MX cards from NVIDIA. Even when those companies stopped making reference designs for PCI-based cards, add-in board partners filled the void with their own designs for many years after. So essentially, PCI lived on through opportunistic third-party companies looking to sell cards to anyone regardless of their needs and limitations, bringing with it faster and more advanced graphics chips even as speed ceased to be a big concern. Intentional or not, the limitations of PCI were being explored throughout the generations and have in the process pushed well beyond them. So what is the fastest PCI graphics card? It's been several years now since we've seen the release of a new one, and with fewer and fewer motherboard platforms, including legacy slots, it's fairly safe to say that we've finally reached the end of new PCI card introductions. Many people watching this who have already researched this question know the answer, and it comes from a company named Zotac. Zotac, a company exclusively focused on NVIDIA, is among the last companies to address the shrinking PCI graphics market. While there are PCI cards based on ATI GPUs of a similar generation, they fall short of the NVIDIA offerings from Zotac and are borderline impossible to find these days. In truth, the fastest PCI graphics card ever made is really two of the fastest PCI graphics cards ever made. They are the GeForce GT 610 and the GT 430. The GT 610 was the last PCI card Zotac has produced, though it is actually a rebranded GT 520 based on the second iteration Fermi line, and not actually based on the newer Kepler architecture of the 600 series, and as such it utilizes a separate clock for its shader cores. Both the GT 610 and the GT 520 are basically indistinguishable in terms of specs, which is good because my GT 610 came dead on arrival. They both have 48 stream processors clocked at 1620 MHz with 8 texture mapping units and 4 raster operators running at 810 MHz. They both have 512 megabytes of regular DDR3 memory clocked at 1334 MHz effectively on a 64-bit bus. In retro terms, this puts its theoretical performance above that of a Radeon 9800 Pro. But just because it was the last PCI card released with an NVIDIA chip doesn't mean it's the fastest. Enter the GT430 from Zotac, a rarer and potentially more powerful card than the GT520. It's based on the first iteration of Fermi and comes with 96 stream processors clocked at 1400 MHz and 16 TMUs with 4 ROPs clocked at 700 MHz. Just like the GT520, it has 512 megabytes of DDR3, this time clocked at 1200 MHz on a 64-bit bus. That puts its theoretical performance in key areas above that of a 7800 GTX. So why don't we test that? Here I put a GT520 and 430 up against the Radeon 9800 Pro and 7800 GTX. And I also threw in a TI 4600, which should be theoretically well below the performance of either of these cards. But we know that PCI bus will be holding these cards back. The question is, by how much? The performance here in 3D Mark 2001 isn't awful, but it's well short of its potential, scoring almost half that of even the 4600. Surprisingly, the GT520 and 430 are only 72 points apart in favor of the theoretically slower 520, perhaps due to the slightly higher memory bandwidth and pixel fill rate. In 3D Mark 2003, both PCI cards turn in much better performance than the TI 4600, and perhaps thanks to the larger number of stream processors, the GT430 is a little bit faster than the GT520. Neither cards come close to reaching the 9800 Pro, however, and the 7800 GTX can't even see them from its massive lead. Then in 05, both PCI cards get a little less than half the result of the 9800 Pro, with the 7800 GTX more than doubling that. In Quake 3, while performance is plenty serviceable on both GTs, the other three cards are on a different level. Once again, the GT520 performs a little bit faster than the GT430, and this might be because of Quake 3's sensitivity to memory bandwidth. The PCI cards don't cope too well in Serious Sam: The Second Encounter, both hovering around the 30 FPS mark with the TI 4600 at more than double the performance, and both the 9800 Pro and 7800 GTX are well above 100 FPS. The cards do an excellent job in Halo, and although there was occasional hitching, the overall frame rate is very high on the PCI cards, well above the TI 4600 in DirectX 8 mode, and even the 9800 Pro. The GT430 even edges out the GT520 a little bit. The 7800 GTX understandably stands out far ahead of the others. Half-Life 2, on the other hand, seemed barely fazed by the limitations of PCI, as both cards have no problem standing in front of the TI 4600 by a wide margin, despite the 4600 running a slightly easier DirectX 8 code path in this game. Performance actually gets fairly close to the 9800 Pro, but it, along with the 7800 GTX, still get a strong lead. Nonetheless, Half-Life 2 is a very enjoyable experience on either PCI card. In Doom 3, we're seeing a decent compromise on PCI performance. It's hindered, but still reasonable compared to the two AGP cards. Once again, the GT520 squeaks a couple frames past the GT430, but neither card can quite match the 9800 Pro. So performance overall is very inconsistent, depending entirely on how the game engine is written, the age of the game, and of course your settings. PCI is so limiting that even though we're comparing a card with 96 stream processors and 16 TMUs to a card with half as many, there's barely any difference between them, with many cases going in favor of the lower spec'd but higher clocked card. You won't be playing anything remotely modern on either of these cards, so DirectX 10 and 11 functionality won't see much use. But then again, gaming was never really the focus for these cards, so what are they good for? Well, for starters, they're a pretty easy way to add a lot of displays to an older system. And when I say older system, I mean that pretty loosely, as many high-end systems from the early 2010s could still be found with PCI slots. And many gamers running systems with Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge probably have a couple of them. But in all honesty, it's hard to find a lot of people that need more displays than a single graphics card can give. Most modern graphics cards even budget ones, can support 3 displays simultaneously. And each of these PCI cards would give another 3 outputs on top of that. They're also useful for video. PCI provides too little bandwidth for streaming pre-decoded video, and in fact, while playing games, I noticed most video intros turn into slideshows. But they come with very capable video decoders embedded in the GPU, so if you're working with H.264 or other high-definition encoded videos, it's a pretty good solution for very slow systems. And being passively cooled is also a nice bonus for media center PCs. They're also fully CUDA capable, I think. In truth, I wasn't actually able to finish the Geekbench 4 test after hours had elapsed, so I'm not actually sure if the driver or the software is able to really cope with a CUDA device over PCI. So who are these cards made for? Well, the fact of the matter is that there just aren't a lot of people that would actually benefit from cards such as these. You'd have to have a really old system without an AGP or PCI Express slot and have no intention to play any sort of modern game or even games from 10 years ago. Or you'd have to have the need for a whole ton of displays running alongside your primary graphics card. Trying the card out in my main desktop PC running 64-bit Windows 10, I encountered a lot of issues just running a web browser, and YouTube turned into a glitchy mess. Maybe an older driver would fix this, I'm not sure. I didn't really have a lot of time, so I couldn't really fully troubleshoot the issue. Even still, just the fact that these cards exist is really interesting and a bit of a curiosity for people like me that just want to see what happens when you take a modern GPU and you cross it with an extremely old and honestly debilitating interface like PCI. 133 megabytes per second shared between all the other PCI devices in your system, including many of your motherboard's integrated features such as audio. It's crazy. Even 2x AGP offers 4 times that amount and doesn't have to share that bandwidth with anything else. A modern PCI Express 3.0 1x slot offers almost 1 gigabyte of bandwidth, and such graphics cards do actually exist that use that, so that might be something that could be interesting to look at in the future. Anyway, I hope you like this look at the world's fastest PCI graphics card. I have more plans in the future with the PCI slot, so I'll be returning back to this topic at a future date, so stay locked to this channel for that. Thanks for watching. I'm Nathan, and this has been Pixel Pipes.